Each other. My name is Luna, and Red Ant Collective is an anti-imperialist and socialist organization. Can you go to the next slide, please? The 5 main pillars are peace, jobs, land, bread, space, homes, bread, space, and Fight for Our City is an educational series that we're hosting once a month here at the International District Library and online for comrades who are unable to meet in person. And during these educational series, we're going to explore the history of our city, Albuquerque, and the greater state from a socialist and anti-imperialist perspective. So for today, we're really excited to have people online and in person. So for that reason, I'm going to use a mic. If at any time, for the folks online, if you can't hear me, please let me know in the chat. Or if you can't see the speakers at any time, please let us know. And I'll announce the guests, both guests today. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Ted Jojola of the University of New Mexico. He's going to speak about the Pueblo Revolt, a rebellion which drove colonizers out of the Southwest, and it was a defining moment in New Mexico history. And this is not particularly unique to our city, but obviously it's very important to the shaping of our city. And then we're going to hear from Jerome Chavez, who's from the University of New Mexico as well. He's going to be talking about Chicano resistant movements and the urbanization of the city from the 40s to the 70s. And we chose these 2 topics as our first official class because we really wanted to ground our class in the history of resistance against colonial and bourgeois interests. So after each speaker, we'll have like a discussion and a Q&A. And so this means we're first going to hear from Dr. Ted Jojola, then we'll discuss and have any questions for him. Then we'll hear from Jerome. Before I guess, go to really introduce our speaker, are there any questions from anyone? Oh, right. Okay, so the question was, how long has Red Ant Collective been together? And the answer was 2 years. Great. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so this is what we will be discussing today, the Pueblo Revolt and the urbanization of Albuquerque. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so we're so honored to have an incredible speaker today. Like, this is truly really special. Dr. Ted Jojola, he's a director, distinguished Regents Professor of University of New Mexico's Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. He's had a career as an educator and a practitioner in urban and regional planning, specializing in indigenous planning, and he's taught at the University of New Mexico since 1980. Come on in. Thank you for coming. We're just going through our introductions and introducing our first speaker. Dr. Ted Jojola has served as Director of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico from 1980 to 1996, Acting Director of the Community and Regional Planning Program in 95 through 96, and Director in 2004 through 2005. And part of the reason we asked him to speak today is because he wrote, there was an anthology put together on Popeye and the Pueblo Revolt, edited by Joe Sando, and he wrote The Legacy of the Pueblo Revolt and the Tigre Province. So we're really honored to have him, and let's just give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Luna, and thank you, Red Ant Collective. It's the first time I've heard of this organization, but it sounds really interesting, and definitely supportive of looking at alternative perspectives in terms of what it is that we've all been really passionate about, especially in terms of our latest scholarship around place knowing. And this is essentially an area that we've been championing through our Indigenous Design and Planning Institute in a way to sort of frame the conversation of why place matters. And it really is the outcome of work that we've been doing under originally what was called place making. Some of you probably are familiar with that national initiative by Art Place America in order to look at building more equitable economic development in rural areas, particularly with local assets largely being around artists. But in that process, there were 21 groups that are indigenous who were also funded, including us, for a number of projects. And we essentially took that organization to task and essentially asked them if we could, they could help sponsor a series of meetings, conferences with like-minded people to talk about what they understood about placemaking. And in that conversation, we learned very quickly that they really didn't understand, nor did they relate to it from that kind of perspective of places that are already made or places that are being made. Rather, they really instead honed in on this notion that our places are already made as Indigenous people, and that it's our birthright and responsibility in order to be able to continue these and sustain them through right of inheritance onto those generations that would succeed us. So that became essentially the foundation of place knowing. And it's articulated best by, I think, some of the elders of communities that we've worked with who basically have articulated this notion that if we don't walk the land with our children, then we won't know the meaning of our places, we won't know our culture, we won't know our language, we won't know those things that really are integral to our identity. So I think that, a series like this, thinking about how it is that we know about places and how that landscape then translates is very much attuned to how we can construct alternative perspectives, especially amongst communities and people who don't have a voice, because a large part of, I think, the kind of way that we've been characterized as Native people or Indigenous people or people who have grown up in this particular area has been voices from the other. Basically, people who have come here, essentially even changed and attuned the landscape to represent the Midwest with this ubiquitous elm trees, which I hate with a passion. But also even in terms of how it is that we situate ourselves in terms of our particular kinds of land uses. And in a sense, particularly now that we're all facing this new emergency of climate change, that we're now pulling back into traditional knowledge as a way in order to be able to build responsive ways that we lived with the land according to original instructions from our ancestors, and that's going to be important for us to continue to be to survive into the future with all the kind of changes that are coming in our direction. Okay, that's all by way of saying that I'm going to talk about the Pueblo Revolt in just a second, but first, just to be respectful and say, Hinumo Kimam Herimbach, how are you doing this evening? I'm from the Pueblo of Isleta, where I was born and raised and still live there. As Luna had indicated, I'm one of the longest lived faculty at the University of New Mexico. I started way back in 1980. And ironically, the reason I got the job was exactly the same reason I'm here tonight, which was to talk about the Pueblo Revolt. Because at that time, they were celebrating some centennial around the Pueblo Revolt. And as the people were speaking, I sort of raised my hand, and this was just coming out of my dissertation research at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii, where I was looking at essentially what were the impacts of American territorial and Spanish colonial regimes on Indigenous people, both here and in the Philippines, and sort of trying to then understand how they were able to continue their sense of resiliency in the face of all this incursion that was going on. So it started with that conversation about the Pueblo Revolt, because in my conclusion about the Pueblo Revolt, I like to sort of frame it from the context of what my late son said one time when he came back from school, and he said, "Dad, I learned a new term in history today." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Pyrrhic victory. Do you know what it means?" And I said, "No, but it sounds kind of interesting." So he was explaining it to me. But basically, the Pueblo Revolt is a Pyrrhic victory. And that is to say that you can win the war, but in actuality, you end up losing more than you gain. Oftentimes, I think when the Pueblo Revolt is framed, it's usually much more from this kind of romantic notion of, oh, here's the Pueblos. They all collectively got together and they kicked the butts of the Spanish and they forced them down south and they had to reestablish themselves in El Paso, Texas, took some of their converts with them. And we still have the remnants of Isleta del Sur, which is a Pueblo community that has its origins in the Salinas area. But if you had looked at the vibrancy and the richness of Pueblo people prior to the Pueblo Revolt, it was much, much larger and much, much more vast. When the first entradas came into this area, and it's documented by Fray Dominguez Benavides, that there were just within the Albuquerque area upwards of 50 plus villages, Taiwa villages. And these villages were organized, even under the Spanish framework, according to the language that they spoke. So that's why to this day in downtown Albuquerque, you have Tiwish Park, which is just another corruption of Taiwa, and which is another level of corruption, because if you actually pronounce it correctly, in my language, it's Taiwan. And that's probably the closest to what probably was the reflective meaning at that particular time when somebody comes up to you and says, "Who are you?" Iowan, we're people that live. And that kind of jurisdiction then began to be the framework upon which the Spanish began to think about how they wanted to organize the preoccupation of the area, because it wasn't until later in the 1580s that the actual colonization itself began. And by this time, the Pueblos were steadfastly already here in time and in place. And one of the things that everybody needs to understand is, why do we continue to this day to call ourselves Pueblo Indians? No other indigenous community in the world are called Pueblo Indians. And the reason is because when they came in and they saw the way that we lived, the village itself was actually laid out and designed exactly the same way that the Spanish itself had detailed instructions of colonial settlement within the New World. And it was based on the idea of a central place, the plaza, and then from there radiating the buildings, and then the fields on the outside. And that in the mind of the Spanish, you didn't really belong as a Spanish citizen. Instead, you were a citizen of the town where you then had your birthright. So in this particular case, then, they saw our villages and they said, "Oh my God," literally. What these places look like are the places that we left behind in Spain. And quickly, therefore, from the standpoint of this notion of township authority, then they decreed that if we can, quote, civilize these Pueblo people, but we were already practicing their civilized ways as well, too, then they said the only thing that is really missing is to Catholicize them. And that then will elevate them to the equal status that we have in terms of bringing forth the recognition of their towns. So that's why, beginning in the early 1600s, then you had all this incredible activity that occurred in order to be able to build churches. My church was built in 1604, and many of the pueblos were built around the same period of time. And then that became one of the hallmarks of how a village could petition to the Spanish crown to gain that township authority, by having that church placed within the centrality of the plaza itself. And that's one of the things that's really unique about New Mexico that you don't find anywhere else in the country, is that the plaza is really an important built part of the landform, and that what's key to that is the church that is within the plaza, because from the doors of the church radiated then what we call the land grant. The idea then that you could deed this land to a village in the cardinal directions, enough land in order for them to be able to subsist in terms of a township, and that boundary then was firmly in place in terms of the positioning of the church and the radiating of this in those cardinal directions. So as soon as the Spanish then deeded the pueblos in terms of that township authority and then gave them their own land grants, then that's why we took on this notion of being Pueblo Indians. So it wasn't a description by any chance, but it was totally intended in order to acknowledge the fact that we had elevated ourselves to the same level as the colonialists would when they began to actually settle into the Southwest. So what difference does that make? Well, it made a heck of a lot of difference, because in a sense, it sort of laid the foundation for the context of what would become the Pueblo Revolt, when in fact, even within the Spanish colonial domain, there was internal tension between the secular government and between the religious authorities. Because under the Spanish domain, the religious authorities were supposed to be the conscience of the Spanish Empire, whereas the colonial secular authority were the ones that were supposed to get the benefits of occupying a place and then sending a proportion of their gain back to the King of Spain. But the King of Spain owned the entire lands, and nobody owned individual property per se within that particular construction, with the sole exception of the plaza. The plaza was called the Fondo Legal, which is where that was the only part that was actually severed from the King of Spain. And it then became the basis of what it is that we know now in terms of the reservation system, because this is what transferred through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo when the United States agreed to uphold all the international statutes and covenants that had been afforded to the people that were residing there. So the Pueblos then essentially came up through that system, and when then the clergy and when the government authorities then began to fight with each other, they tried essentially to win over the allegiance of the Pueblo people, to win over the other. And it was essentially these instructions that were forthcoming from the secular government and from the religious government, and this going on back and forth, that the Pueblo people themselves essentially saw themselves being torn back and forth and essentially being exploited, and each one then trying to dominate to the point where none of this made sense. And it was essentially then the fervent part of what then began to be the reason why they wanted to formulate this Pueblo Revolt. And by no means was it the only successful indigenous revolt in the Americas. There were many more that were further south into Mesoamerica. It just so happens that because we're here in the United States, everybody kind of singles us out as being one of the only ones, but actually it wasn't. There were these revolts that were taking place all over the place. But what happened, and this is why I call it then a Pyrrhic victory, is because when then the Pueblo people decided to oust the colonialists from this area, they upset the balance in the region. And that balance was really fragile because it had the Spanish colonialists, it had the Pueblo people, and then it had all the others. And those others were the Comanches, the Navajos, the Apaches, all of these particular groups who essentially did not even want to call it kowtow to the Spanish authority and were considered then to be the other, or sort of like what I like to call Christians in training wheels, but they never themselves subjugated themselves and allowed themselves to be dominated by Christianity. And as a result of that, the Spanish could impose what was called just war, the idea that because they didn't have the rationale in order to come over and become Christianized, then they were less than human, and therefore less than human, they could be beasts of burdens in the eyes of the Spanish, and therefore then they could be enslaved in sight. So there was this incredible kind of cultural turmoil that occurred where there was raiding that was going on all the time. You had these envoys that went all the way up to Nebraska, Kansas, in order to be able to bring the most valuable commodity back. And no, it wasn't a watermelon or a melon or corn or anything like that. It was women and children. And those women and children then that were brought back then were intermarried within the Spanish Dominion, but because they were seen as being Plains Indians or those from the other side, then they were strategically placed in frontier towns in order to be able to develop a zone of defense to protect both the Spanish, with the Pueblos also being their allies. And that legacy today is known as the Genízaro societies, which still exist. So it was really a very complex kind of interplay. But when the Pueblo Revolt itself then was staged and the Spanish were ousted, all of that balance, that delicate balance, just basically went to hell. If I can use a Christian idiom, it went to hell. So what transpired then is that the Pueblo people suddenly found themselves in arrears because they could no longer really defend themselves against all the other groups that were positioned on the outside. And in many cases, then the Pueblos became unsettled because they then were attacked by other nomadic people coming into this area. And they then, in order to be able to preserve themselves, fled to other allies. And in many cases, these were up north, all the way up to the Utes, for example. They fled all the way to Moki, which is the Hopi area to this day. My people went there and stayed in Oraibi and those villages there. And in the 12-year period then, when the Spanish basically were not resettled back in this area, then there was a huge migration of our own native people to other places, so that by the time the Spanish actually got their stronghold back into this area, many of the communities themselves were abandoned. And in fact, it was the friars who essentially staged the process whereby they went back to these remote communities to try and gain and win these converts back, because if they didn't do that and repopulate some of our villages, then they wouldn't have any congregations to deal with themselves. So they lost a lot of power from that particular standpoint. In the case of Isleta, it took 3 trips to Hopi to get people back. They resettled in an area that's still in our traditional language on the south side of the village is called Oraibi, out of the namesake of Oraibi and Hopi. And probably the reason why was because when they were brought back, they not only brought us back as Taiwas, they brought Coresians, they brought Toas, all other language groups there, staged them in Isleta, and it became sort of like a refugee camp, and then dispersed them out into the surrounding communities in order to reestablish their domains. But, and this is the Pyrrhic victory part, the opportunity then was afforded for the colonist regime to come back and gain favor of those families and the soldiers that were part of that reconquest, to then get those villages and those places that were now abandoned and then give them grants as well too, as an enticement for them to come back. So who knows in that process? I haven't actually ever seen a study of this, but I'm sure it would be a really important and interesting one. Who knows how many of those lands were actually lost in that process? Because out of those hundreds of Pueblo villages that existed prior to the Pueblo Revolt, then we only have 20 Pueblos left, 19 in New Mexico and one in Texas, and that's it. So right now in total population, we're about 45,000, upwards in that area. Probably during the time of the first entradas, it was more like 250, maybe to 500,000 of us in this area that we call the Rio Grande Basin and the San Juan Basin. So that's essentially the kind of context of the Pueblo Revolt in terms of the determination of what it is that happened in time and place. And basically, those relationships were kept pretty well intact until Mexican independence and then to the American territorial period. American territorial government had their own agenda, and that was to take as much land as possible, open it up to the homestead. And there's one particular map that, if you can find it, is really interesting, and that's in New Mexico in maps if you have access to that. And it shows all the land grants that existed in New Mexico and all the Hispano and Indian settlements that existed in New Mexico. And fully 95% of them were abandoned as a result of statehood. And the reason there being that the Pueblo people, even though the federal government recognized our land grant status, my ancestors and that leadership quickly resolved in their minds that if they didn't seek to go under the wardship of the federal government, that their lands would be summarily taxed and they would lose them. The Hispano land grant communities did not have that ability to be able to be determined as American Indians. So they were then taxed to death and they lost many of their communal lands. And these communal lands are essentially where the urban areas have really come to bear and flourish. Rio Rancho is a very good example of that. Originally, it was a land grant. It was bought for 50 cents an acre. And then over successive decades, then became the fodder for developers. And now you see that large community there, but originally it was a land grant. West Side is now facing that same sort of situation. And their heirs about 10, 15 years ago gave up many of their collective rights to those lands. And now everybody's looking at the West Side in terms of booming as the next sort of area of expansion for Albuquerque. And the only thing that is keeping that from happening is that the water that exists in the Rio Perco is too saline. So it can't be mined for domestic water. So unless they solve that thing, it will help stave that development that's out there. But if they find a rich source of clean, palatable water, you might as well kiss the West Side goodbye. So these are some of the kind of determining things that have really occurred. But the Pueblo Revolt, from our standpoint, helped to really stage that from the standpoint of when we actually had that sovereign authority as vested in terms of being in the township authority, to then when we transferred out as a result of this disruption through the Pueblo Revolt, and then when the colonialists came back and then took the opportunity to occupy our places and basically diminish our presence within the region here. So that, in a nutshell, I hope kind of gives you a framework for rethinking how it is that we, in a sense, played our sense of victimness, I guess if you want to call it, within this region, and how it is then that consequently the kind of growth and development within the area itself was situated as a result of. that incident of the Pueblo Revolt. Okay, so Luna's going to push me off the stage.
I'm not. No, I just want to make sure everyone online can hear. Thank you so much. And I just want to, I have a couple of questions, but I want to open it up first. Does anyone have any questions, like discussion, want to respond in any way? It's amazing. So one of the things I was wondering if you could expand on a little bit. One of the first things you were talking about in terms of how the Spanish colonizers came and really thought about dividing the people based off of language group. And I'm wondering if you can expand a bit on how the different nations and peoples coexisted and lived alongside each other before the Spanish came.
So if you kind of think about it from the standpoint of human settlements, the areas that were occupied by different types of language groups coexisted side by side. And we share a lot of the same type of cultural underpinnings in terms of our worldview, our ceremony. But what's amazing about this is that our languages are indistinguishable from each other. Isleta's right next to Laguna. Laguna is Carriz speaking. We cannot communicate at all. It's a totally different language. Zuni Pueblo is a language isolate, and that means that linguists have so far not found any other language in the world that is even related to Zuni Pueblo. So you have all of these. The only other place I've seen something similar to our area is Oaxaca, where you have tribal groups that are situated very close to each other, that look the sort of same from the facade, but they're actually very different in terms of their sort of culture and language. And that part of it is really the result of the fact that our people were highly migratory. And when we talk about the clans that exist in our communities, like we have, I think, 8 clans in my Pueblo community, these clans came together in time and place. But before they came to what's Isleta, they were migrating all over the world because those were part of the original instructions to go to the 4 corners of the world and then come back to the heart place, which is the plaza, which has our meaning that's attached to how we believe that we emerge from the center of the earth. And in that sense, then, all of the Pueblos also have that same time and place of these different clans, which are matrilineal, coming together. And had we not then been subjected to being forced to stay in the same place because now we're in reservations, then some of our clans would still be moving around. I remember having a great conversation with a friend of mine from Walpi and Hopi, and she was part of the Sun Clan. So we got to go all the way to the very, very top building in that amazing village. And you could see the whole area there. And she said the Cocopelis, the flute clan that came to the village, are one of the groups now that has recently settled. And she said they're still not considered to be part of the Hopis, but they're living here. And I said, what do you mean recently come? And she says, about 800 years ago, they came from Mesa Verde into this area. So you can imagine how long it takes in order to be able to do that. So you can get a sense of the longevity of how long these processes take. And even in my own village, we have upwards of 250 villages that we named that we had lived in before we came to Isleta. So you do the math.
Go for it. What's your question?
Thank you for sharing all this knowledge with us. To ask if, so you mentioned that once the Spanish were kicked out, the Pueblos came under threat from other native groups. Did the Spanish presence weaken the Pueblos for them to come under threat in the first place? Or would this, do you think, have happened anyway?
Well, when the Spanish first came into the area, we had relations with all sorts of people, all the way down to Mesoamerica and beyond. So that was not uncommon. What the Spanish did, though, of course, is that they tried to dominate. And as a consequence of that, once the Pueblos aligned with them, then the other groups saw us as being enemies of theirs. So, enemies, we being both enemies. So that put us into very fragile kinds of situations because this trade and barter situation still occurred, especially within the frontier areas like Salinas, for instance, which was a great center for salt mining. And Plains people would come in and trade and barter. But of course, it was the Spanish that tried to intervene and take over that, so that those relationships themselves became strained. So at some point, the Spanish decided to also give arms to the Pueblos as allies for the kind of forays that were occurring, because I guess the Pueblos saw advantages to that as well too. And those basically, were some of the things that really built that kind of unease, I guess, if you want to call it from that standpoint. But, we had raiding societies all here, the Navajo, the Comanche, the Apache. They were raiding societies. And, as you see our villages themselves evolve, they themselves also became fortified in order to be able to keep those groups at a distance. So it just kind of, I guess, mattered from place to place how any of those relationships were maintained. On the other hand, there were great relationships that still continue. Taos Pueblo is a really good example of that. They had great relationships with the Kiowas, and they actually have incorporated a lot of that language into their Taiwa. They're also Taiwa speakers like us, but they speak a different dialect, and it's a little hard to understand what it is that they're saying. But that's why when you look at them, they look like Plains Indians. They have those long braids and things of that sort, whereas our hair is always cut back or pushed back from that standpoint. So those relationships just kind of vary from place to place. You have to sing a song.
No songs today. Well, so in my opinion, American history often suffers from the dominant narrative lying on an east and west axis. It's usually the story of manifest destiny, of colonists moving from the east coast to the west and expanding that way. But it seems to me that the Pueblo Indians are perfectly situated to recuperate history as told in the four directions. And I really appreciate what you said about the ancestral migrations that were happening along that northern and southern axis, with diffusion into Mexico and back and forth. And I was wondering, to what extent was the Pueblo Revolt and the value of rebellion and revolt an element of cultural diffusion with indigenous peoples south of what's today the border? You mentioned that there were other rebellions that we don't often hear about because there's a border there, right? That creates this artificial separation between the histories. But to what extent did the Pueblo Revolt actually influence those other rebellions? Or were those more compartmentalized to their geographic regions? Thank you.
I think that in our own sort of minds, we always want to be able to identify with the so-called winner. But like I said, in our case, if you look at the overall impact, we were really winner losers. And a lot of these episodes really did not make it into mainstream history because of exactly what you said. It was really the settler colonial kind of voice that dominated. And the real fact of the matter is that they have a written language, whereas ours is an oral language. So even in terms of scholarship, oral languages are discredited. So nobody really wanted to pay and still doesn't pay attention to this kind of narrative, even though our Pueblo people have been telling anthropologists and archaeologists for decades that this is our interpretation of things. But unless they themselves can come up with so-called proof, and that is either through the written narrative or through material culture or whatever, then it's kind of discredited and discounted from that standpoint. But I'm happy to say that, that oral history is still really vibrant. But our people have also learned that those kinds of stories are dangerous in the sense of the fact that if they're widely known, then there's elements there that will still try and repress it. And that was, some of the kind of legacy that got staged during the boarding school era, for example, where we were transformed into the other and not allowed to speak languages and not allowed to associate and develop that sort of practice of the culture itself. And of course, there's varying degrees of that experience across the country as well, too. But so that kind of knowledge, in a way, is still somewhat of a dangerous thing. But I think that now the prospectus is that, as I kind of qualified at the very beginning, ancestral knowledge, the idea of understanding the places where you come from, understanding that relationship, and then using that traditional knowledge the way the ancestors did in order then to cope with the kind of emergencies that we're now having, that's gaining credence. And there's a vibrant discussion that's going on right now that I'm part of, for example, about bringing the technology of Adobe back as a way to deal with developing more green and sustainable kinds of architecture. And so, it goes on. Society is fluid, and like anything else, it goes in cycles. So you have your high moments and you have your low moments.
Let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jojola. We're going to transition to have Jerome Chavez speak. Okay, so while we wait for that, I'm going to introduce Jerome Chavez. Again, just as a reminder, we wanted to situate our first class in this series in early labor resistance movements of the city and the state. Of course, the Pueblo Revolt, which is way earlier, as well as now Jerome Chavez will talk about urbanization of Albuquerque. So Jerome Chavez was born and raised in Albuquerque. His family has had roots in the States for many generations, and he's currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Chicano and Chicana Studies at the University of New Mexico. He became a community activist at an early age. In high school, he was a member of La Raza Unida Youth Committee, and he participated in Solidarity March against Proposition 187 in California. He graduated from the University of New Mexico in 2006, earning a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and American Studies. And then he moved to Denver, and while in Denver, he became involved in the Chicano and Mexican community there and continued doing work for social justice. He helped organize several events against war, against police brutality, and for immigrant rights and international solidarity. So he helped organize the Transform Columbus Day March in 2007 and the Recreate 68 Counter Convention against the Democratic National Convention in 2008. In 2014, the 40th anniversary of the deaths of Los Seis de Boulder Chicano activists, he assisted in the Symbols of Resistance commemoration for Chicano movement martyrs from Colorado. So let's give a warm welcome to Jerome Chavez.
So my presentation, comes up through my my master's thesis, which was titled "It Was Really Up to Us: The History of the Black Berets of Albuquerque and the Chicano Movement of New Mexico." And the reason I did this is because, being a resident and being from Albuquerque, I know that there was a lot of stories that, are yet to be told, and especially in the Chicano movement. I am in the Chicano Studies department, but even in that department, has not been a lot of work done on, New Mexico in the Chicano movement. And so I chose that as my thesis. And if you could go to slide number 7, we could go ahead and start there. That's a bunch of other boring stuff, which is one to hear. So, just so looking at that history, I also kind of wanted to do a background about Albuquerque and how it came to be. And so this will be a brief history of Albuquerque, probably up to the 70s. So I look at the development of Albuquerque as a major urban area during the Chicano movement, how it came to be, and I use what's called an internal colonial model. So Albuquerque itself was founded in 1706, and it went through Spanish, Mexican, and American colonialism. And but during all this time itself, it didn't change that much. And also around Albuquerque was many other communities, such as Alameda, Los Garcias, Los Ranchos, Los Poblamos, Los Gallegos, Los Griegos, Los Candelarias, Los Duranes, Atrisco, Los Sanchez, Pajarito, Borealis, and Los Padillas. So around this time, these were all pretty much autonomous communities, and also centered around acequias, basically gravity ditches from the Rio Grande River that they use for agriculture. And let's see, so the major changes came after the American invasion and occupation of 1848, with the conclusion of what's called the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the whole northern half of Mexico came under U.S. dominance. And the major change in also, in 1867, an American military supply depot was set up in Albuquerque, and hundreds of military personnel engaged with that depot, mainly European Americans. In 1880, with the arrival of the railroad, Albuquerque then began many dramatic changes. With the railroad was a revolution in transportation. Many Anglo citizens came from the east to settle. New buildings were built, and it began the growth of Albuquerque as an urban center. And and the increased population affected it. Now the area around the railroad became known as Newtown, in contrast to what was known as Old Town or Old Albuquerque. And it was closer to the Rio Grande. And in case you don't know, Old Town itself used to be an actual community. It had acequias going through it, and people lived there. And through a process, it gradually became a big tourist trap that we know it as today. But in that, a lot of residents were displaced. In 1891, Albuquerque was incorporated as a city, and when it had a majority Anglo population, and it was surrounded by these Hispano villages, which pretty much had their own autonomous governance. And the political life of Albuquerque became dominated by that Anglo elite. Back then, they had a city commission type of government, and with a city manager. And just recently, they were trying to go back to that. Get rid of the mayor, which had a more stronger governance. To a city manager. But, that in the beginning, that's what Albuquerque had. And so the changes in the city mainly affected the Hispano population surrounding it. As I mentioned, they had it had a pretty much mixed economic system. They had subsistence farming, livestock ranching, and they supplemented it with their part-time wages and barter. As that economic model began to decline with urbanization, their acequias mainly became used for weekend activity, gardening, and so forth. And also with the coming of the railroad, many residents, especially in Borealis, got employment there, and they that became their main means of living. So that created a lot of the major changes there. One other major factor was the establishment of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District in 1925. And it was supposed to regulate irrigation. With this new authority, many Hispanos lost their land. One scholar says that by 1937 alone, about 8,000 people lost title to their property because they couldn't pay their assessments to this new conservancy district. And in the history, it is one of the major factors in land loss for Hispano-Chicano people. And by the 1940s, another type of colonialism affected Albuquerque, nuclear colonialism. And there's a new book by scholar Mariah Gomez, Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, and she describes nuclear colonialism as a neo-colonial framework that targets not only indigenous people, but also other ethnic minority groups in poor economic situations that have become disenfranchised because of state occupations of their homelands. And New Mexico itself became the site of the Manhattan Project during World War II, which developed the first nuclear weapons. And, if you saw Oppenheimer during this summer, probably got an overview of that. And this itself was a colonial process. And as a lot of the land was taken from not only indigenous people, from a lot of Hispano landowners, and ultimately, this created after World War II, it created a dependence upon the nuclear economy. And Gomez and many other scholars document that process. So Albuquerque itself also became dependent upon that new economy. The location of the city made it a major part of the Manhattan Project. It was 2 hours away from Los Alamos. And Kirtland Airfield opened in 1941, became a major part of the transportation for that project. And a branch of Los Alamos called Z Division was established in the airfield, and that eventually became Sandia Labs. And after the war, the growth of the beginning of the Cold War, with growth of military spending, the military economy would drive not only the state, but especially the city. A few statistics. After Sandia Labs became an independent corporation, the employment went up. It was they employed 1,700 people in 1949. By 1959, 10 years later, that went up to 7,000. And by 1957, overall, about 30% of the city of Albuquerque was employed at either Kirtland or Sandia. And so the city of Albuquerque became dependent upon government jobs. If you want to go to the next slide. And these jobs were given to people from out of state, and mainly Anglos with higher degrees to take them. And so other defense-related industries grew in New Mexico, and and another institution, UNM, grew as a research university, and it was tied to that federal agenda of science and technology research. A magazine at the time, Working Women, described Albuquerque during this period in the 50s as a community mired in the easy bureaucratic life. So that became what Albuquerque was known for in the 50s, and with all this new employment, became a housing boom, and that boom mainly happened in the east side of the city, and that happened because on the west side there was more land that was either land grants or land that was that Hispanos have owned through the generations. So then there was a lot more land available in the east, and that became available through annexations, either forcefully or through just voluntary, where the landowners gave them up to become part of the Albuquerque city limits. And so by 1970, in this map here, we see this shows like the kind of racial composition of Albuquerque, and as you can see, the darker portions of it are the Hispano Chicano populations, and the darker portions are closer to the river, where those Ezequiel communities are, and those are also known as the North Valley and the South Valley, and it's where the Hispano-Chicano population was centered. And on the east side, it's mainly Anglo, and also we could look at the growth of population over time. By 1940. Albuquerque itself was about 30,000 people. By 1970, it became close to about 300,000 people. So it's about an 8 times increase. And also, I put Bernalillo County on there because it is a lot. It is some of the area is outside Albuquerque city limits, but it was also affected by that urbanization process. And for Hispanos, the population, their percentage of population declined. They were about almost 50% of Bernalillo County, about 35% of Albuquerque itself in the city limits. By 1950, that went down to about 25%. By 1960, it went down to a little above 20%, and It went up a little bit in 1970, but what this did is, it reduced the power of Hispano-Chicano people, and the power of Albuquerque became centered around Anglos, and so and with all this. Not only the nuclear economy, but Albuquerque's spatial area expanded. A lot of city boosters after the war just wanted to get more land. They first annexed Old Town, and there was a lot of resistance to that, but gradually they lost that battle, and it became part of Albuquerque, part of the growing city of Albuquerque. And as I mentioned earlier, there was many different autonomous Hispano communities, and through processes, those communities gradually became annexed into Albuquerque. And let's see, the one community was Atrisco that was in the South Valley. It was originally a land grant, and the governance of that became known. It became a corporation that's became known as Westland, and the governing board sold a lot of that land grant land to the city of Albuquerque. Ultimately included a lot of land that was not in the original agreement, but a lot of communities did try to resist annexation, and try to form their own towns with their own governance, but they did pass a law in the 60s that prevented any town within a 5-mile radius of a large municipality from having its own governance, so which affected most of these communities. So a lot of these autonomous acequia communities ultimately became the barrios of Albuquerque. And ultimately, even for a lot of Hispanos who were on the GI Bill, who got into the middle class, they moved into newer housing developments in the Northeast Heights. So these barrios were also affected by this loss of economy, and with that, a lot of social ills, crime, drugs, and so forth, began to increase, and also the loss of autonomy also created a loss of a lot of social norms. And by 1970, Albuquerque was known as have one of the highest crime rates in the United States. And kind of a similar thing going on today. So a lot hasn't changed, but it's because of a lot of this process. And so another neighborhood that was affected was Borellis. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the community was employed through the railroads, and the rail yards shut down in let's see, just going through my notes here, by about 1970, and a lot of people lost their jobs, and poverty affected that area. And by 1970, Borellis, Martineztown, and South Broadway were known to have some of the highest poverty rates in the country. And another thing that affected the barrios was urban renewal programs. And most of the housing there was classified substandard. A lot of them still were adobe, had outdoor toilets, And, urban renewal is also known as urban removal. And so that affected a lot of residents. And in Martineztown, a lot of residents there did organize. So part of it is known as the Citizens Improvement Committee of Martineztown, and they resisted a lot of urban renewal there. And so also by this time in the 1960s, there was war and poverty programs. Albuquerque became known as a model city, and it was, part of the purpose of the war and poverty was to empower the poor, but to an extent. So when a lot of that empowerment became too much, a lot of those programs, were shut down. And to wrap it up, this is also the time when the Chicano movement was taking off, and one of the main leaders in the Chicano movement was Reyes Lopez Tijerina. He led the land grant movement, known as La Alianza, and he had his headquarters here in Albuquerque. It's on the corner of Mountain and 3rd Street, and it was kind of the center of their activity. And and by 1968, the Poor People's Campaign came through Albuquerque. Tijerina was the regional leader, and that's an important part of the Chicano movement, because that was the first time a lot of people met other groups, outside of their area, and a lot of people in Albuquerque went to Washington, D.C. for that. And, they met groups like the Brown Berets and the Black Berets. When a lot of people got back, a Brown Beret chapter was formed, but it lasted less than a year for many reasons. And then another group was formed the next year, the Black Berets, and they were a bit more successful. And which I write about a lot more, and but a lot of that was due to the urbanization process in Albuquerque that I just described. So I'm probably out of time, so I'll just stop there. And if you have questions.
So, in your words, the loss of autonomy of some of these barrios or some of these communities in Albuquerque led to the loss of what you called social norms. Could you please be more specific about which social norms were lost in this process and what the causal factor was? Like, why were they lost through this process?
Oh, yeah, they were, before the annexation, they were close-knit communities. People knew each other in their neighborhoods, and they had mutual aid societies, and which they did dances and helped each other out and so forth. But with growing urbanization, a lot of this sense of community was lost, and so before they didn't fear anyone breaking into their houses or anything else because they knew each other. But as Albuquerque became more urbanized, a lot of this sense of community was lost, and with growing poverty, growing drug use, brought in growing crime. And so which was a direct result of this loss of community, and also just a loss of sense of control over their community, if that makes sense.
Well, you spoke about specifically on this slide about the booming population and the mass changes, I think can be reflected in some of the stuff that's happening today. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of, or any perspective on like what drove a lot of the changes in the past past decade in Albuquerque? Is it, for example, the film industry, or perhaps just like gradual change because we have Sandia Labs and Los Alamos Labs in the state? Tech industry, perhaps. I'm not sure if you can speak to any of that.
Well, I would say that just the rapid growth of the city, and not only was it the growth, but it was done in a pretty much a colonial model that, the people who were residents of this city didn't really have a say in it. They brought in the labs, and they brought in all these new employees who became residents of it, and they built the housing and the businesses for them, not for the people who've been here. And just a lot of the growth afterwards was the growth did kind of slow down in the decades after, but still it was just lack of participation in that growth and development. People here don't have a say in like if they're if neighborhoods and houses are not only being torn down, but what's being built here. So, but yeah, overall, just lack of participation in this. And it's a lot more than that, but that's basically.
By lack of participation, do you mean disenfranchisement, like electoral disenfranchisement?
Yeah, electoral and other types of disenfranchisement.
Do we want to get a question? We'll take them both at the same time then.
Okay.
So what's the first?
It says we have started a group of umbrellas, residents of umbrellas, gathering about what is happening in our neighborhood. Do you have any suggestions or ideas that can help us keep them strong?
So the residents of Bareilles, friend or comrade online is asking, or has said that, right, Bareilles is facing a lot of issues right now around development, particularly fighting this developer palindrome. And do you have any suggestions or comments on that situation? And then also, we have another question.
Yeah. My question is, could you say something a little bit about the identity politics that exists right now?
What do you mean by identity politics?
In terms of places like Bareilles and their identity, or Chicanos versus Mexicanos versus Latins versus all of that kind of stuff that's here.
Okay. Well, we'll try within a few minutes, but yeah, I've been following a lot of the anti-gentrification fights, going on in Bareilles, the recent stuff about the stadium and, other things. Yeah, because gentrification has been a long battle. I don't have any solutions or suggestions on that. Just all I say is, keep on doing what you're doing. Let's keep on organizing against this, and find a development that is for the people. Not for all these major corporations and billionaires. But yeah, you guys probably know more about what you need to do. So, it's very inspiring. So keep on doing it. And as for identity politics on Chicano and so forth, a lot of us, identify as Chicano because that was more of a name that we chose for ourselves, and since colonization, a lot of names have been put on us. Some can't really pronounce here, but it's also to Chicanos to get it more in touch with our indigenous roots and our heritage, and to and to just describe the experience of what would be called Mexican Americans or Hispanos in the United States. And there's a long conversation, long controversy over a lot of these labels. Most people don't identify as that. Hispanic was created by the U.S. Census to describe all Spanish-speaking peoples, but just as those of us who are of Mexican descent, we have a unique history, and just want to identify that. So I don't know if that answers that, but.
Thank you so much, comrades, for joining us. We'll see you all in 1 month when our next class is. Just follow us. We don't do too much on social media except for Instagram. Sorry. But if you sign up in the back and put your email and phone number, or however we contact you, whether it's, to find you by this tree at this time on this day, we will be there to give you the flyer or to make sure you know that you're welcome to come back and join us. We don't do too much cleanup, but if you brought anything, make sure you grab it, look around, feel free. Unfortunately, we don't have the space we have the space for a couple more minutes. We don't have much time to hang out tonight. Sometimes it's going to be like that. But yeah, again, thank you so much for joining us. And it is Radiant Collective on Instagram. Our email is radiantcollective@gmail.com. If anybody has any events, always feel free to share anything with us. We will share anything if requested, if we feel it aligns with our 5 core values of peace, land, bread, justice, and jobs. Peace, land, bread, space, jobs. Again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to our presenters. Yes, and we have our next class. It's going to be about the history of labor organizing and the Communist Party in New Mexico. So very, very exciting. October 24th here in this room, 6 p.m. to 7:30. So thank you again, comrades and friends.